Hello. Today I want to talk about systematic planning in the Western Baha'i communities, roughly from 1926 up to 1968. I've divided the presentation into two parts for ease of video recording. So this is from my essay, The Baha'i Faith in the West, a survey, which came out in 2004. Before the general acceptance of the new system of directive assemblies, which I referred to in the previous two videos, most Baha'i activities in the West occurred as a result of individual initiatives and enthusiasms. The slow-moving temple construction project at Wilmette, near Chicago, was one of the few sustained communal efforts. Individual initiative was effective in establishing a widespread network of Baha'i groups, in organizing Baha'i meetings, and in securing the publication of a considerable quantity of Baha'i literature, mostly in English, but also in German. It was relatively unsystematic and uncoordinated, however, and in some areas, notably France, Britain, and Australia, led to little actual growth. The idea of a more coordinated approach to Baha'i activities, particularly that of teaching the cause, was highly attractive to a number of Baha'is. As early as 1915, American Baha'is had made some moves to implement a systematic national teaching campaign. Support for this idea was increased in 1916 by the receipt of the first of Abdu'l-Baha's general letters on teaching, the tablets of the Divine Clan, and again in 1919-1920, when the rest of the letters were received and widely discussed. Even so, it was only in 1925, after the transition to a more directive form of organization, that a systematic plan of unified action from 1926 to 28 was adopted by the North American National Spiritual Assembly. This plan, which received the full backing of Shoghi Effendi, aimed to increase Baha'i teaching endeavors and administrative coordination, and to raise sufficient funds to complete the superstructure of the Wilmette Temple. The success of the plan appears to have been considerably impeded by a general lack of confidence in the National Spiritual Assembly. It was only after the official end of the plan in 1928 that there was a marked improvement in financial contributions. However, the more organized approach to teaching seems to have been successful, and an increasing number of new converts were gained. Growth in numbers continued during a second plan, but again, the financial response was disappointing, doubtless in large part because of the financial depression of the time. I should say, by the way, there's a very useful article by Loni Bramson on the plans of unified action. I'll give the details below the video. The increase in numbers was a significant element in the transformation of the American Baha'i community. The official United States census figures record a fall between 1916 and 1926 from 2,884 Baha'is to 1,247, so that's more than halved. And then, however, an increase by 1936 up to 2,584. These figures have yet to be properly evaluated, but they indicate what was probably a general trend: a loss of numbers during the period in which the transition from universalistic individualism began, and an increase during the period when greater organization was gaining great general acceptance amongst the Baha'is, and a more systematic approach to teaching had been adopted. As the administrative order became an important element in what the new Baha'is were taught before they entered the faith, their conversion strengthened the more exclusivistic approach within the Baha'i community. By the mid-1930s, some 30 to 40% of the American community had become Baha'is since 1925. The two plans of unified action had only limited success in terms of the completion of their stated goals, but they consolidated a general acceptance of what I might term planification as a normal part of Baha'i activity. Shawki Effendi built on this basis to later launch two American 7-year plans, the first from 1937 to 1944, the second from 1946 through to 1953. These plans gave the Baha'is specific domestic and international teaching goals. The first 7-year plan called for Baha'is to settle permanently in all American states, Canadian provinces, and Latin American republics. The second plan required further expansion of the movement throughout the Americas, the establishment of the new National Assembly for Canada and regional assemblies for the South and Central American regions, and the launching of a systematic teaching campaign in post-war Europe. There was also a call for staged work on the Wilmette Temple, which was finally completed in 1953. So this is one of many pictures of the Wilmette Temple, cornerstone laid in 1912, but only finally finished and dedicated for public worship in May 1953. As a consequence of these activities, Baha'i groups were established throughout North America, even in the southern United States, where progress was difficult to accomplish, in part because of the Baha'i teaching of racial equality, in what was then the context of institutionalized white supremacy. Growth was slow but steady, so that by 1947 there were over 5,000 Baha'is in the US. The goal and attainment of Baha'i administrative independence for Canada in the form of the establishment of its own National Spiritual Assembly in 1948 led to an increase in Baha'i activities in that country. By 1961, there were over 1,000 Baha'is in Canada. Alaska and Hawaii subsequently also became independent communities in terms of Baha'i organization. Systematic planning was only adopted in Europe and Australasia in the 1940s, and before that time the local Baha'i communities remained very small. In continental Europe, the rise of Nazi domination also presented a major challenge to the Baha'is. In 1937, that's before the war, all Baha'i activities and institutions were banned in Germany by order of the Gestapo. There was a consequent cessation of Baha'i activities throughout most of continental Europe until 1945-46, when the German Baha'is and others were able to resume their activities, and the American Baha'is began their European teaching campaign. The German and Austrian Baha'is were subsequently given their own teaching plan in 1948, taking them through to 1953. Meanwhile, Baha'is were establishing or re-establishing their residence in most of Western Europe. From the 1950s onwards, a widespread network of Baha'i assemblies was built up at local and national levels, each Baha'i national community eventually establishing its own national spiritual assembly. Some growth also initially occurred in Eastern Europe, but this came to an end with the establishment of communist regimes in the aftermath of World War II. Baha'i teaching activities in these areas, at the time I wrote the essay, had only recently resumed. It continues to the present day. In contrast to the rest of Europe, the formerly lethargic British Baha'i community became increasingly active from the mid-1930s onwards, establishing its own publishing trust and summer school in 1937, and was able to continue its activities throughout the war. In 1944, even though it was still a very tiny community, it adopted its own 6-year plan of internal expansion, and in 1951 was given a new plan by Shoghi Effendi, which, in addition to internal goals, gave the British Baha'is responsibilities for coordinating a project to establish the Baha'i faith in sub-Saharan Africa. In Australia and New Zealand, meanwhile, concerted national activity was impeded by the great distances between the various local groups. A joint National Assembly was formed in 1934, followed by the establishment of a national news bulletin in 1936 and a summer school in 1938. At Shoghi Effendi's encouragement, a small-scale teaching plan was adopted in 1943, to be followed by a more ambitious national plan in 1947, again taking the Australian New Zealand Baha'is up to 1953. Outside of North America, growth was slow, however. By 1952, there were still fewer than 2,000 Baha'is in Europe and Australasia combined. Germany remained the largest community with about 600 Baha'is in 1951. Britain and Australia, with New Zealand, had about 400 each, as did all of the other European countries combined. I should say that the references to all of these figures are in the published paper, so you should look at there if you want to learn more. So that's all I want to say for the moment. For a general overview of Baha'i history, you're welcome to read my Babi and Baha'i Religions from Cambridge, or my short history from One World. There's also one general introduction from Cambridge and a concise encyclopedia from One World. So if you made it so far, thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which these videos would not get made. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give PayPal and Patreon links below. And next week we'll complete this discussion of systematic planning. Have a good day.